It's been 20 years since the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil in U.S. history. Since then, the U.S. has led a global effort to combat international terrorism, but the threats to our national security have only grown. After 9/11, the U.S. government focused on fighting terrorist threats from overseas. But meanwhile, white supremacist and anti-government groups were emerging within America's own borders.
There's groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. I think that while they make a lot of noise, the ones we're really concerned about are the ones that don't have a name. There's other groups that are far more militant, that are operating on the margins of some of these more mainstream right-wing groups and not advertising what they're doing.
Far-right terrorism has significantly outpaced terrorism from other perpetrators, including from individuals inspired by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. In 2020, white supremacists and other like-minded extremists were responsible for 2/3 of the terrorist plots and attacks in the U.S. These groups have also been recruiting more military personnel and law enforcement officers. The percentage of all domestic terrorist incidents linked to active duty and reserve personnel increased from 1.5% in 2019 to over 6% in 2020. One reason domestic terrorism is so difficult to stop is that it's not specifically designated a crime under federal law.
Without one overarching domestic terrorism statute, you don't really get the kind of data that you need to understand the threat. Part of that is because with American citizens, you have civil liberties protections that you don't if you're monitoring people with contacts overseas.
And while right-wing extremism continues to grow in the U.S., its influence is spreading globally.
There are some people on YouTube that are very influential right-wing activists who are getting tens of millions of followers, and there's a concern that that is radicalizing the next generation of people in ways that they don't even realize.
Another escalating concern is cybercrime. In 2016, Russia attempted to hack our presidential election, and in May 2021, a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline forced one of the country's most vital oil pipelines to shut down for several days.
These people are motivated by the potential to make millions of dollars or to wreak havoc on governments or other groups that they don't like.
According to the latest annual U.S. Threat Assessment Intelligence Report, China's push for global power makes it a serious, direct, and growing threat to our national security.
In Afghanistan, in fact, China's already moving very aggressively to expand its influence there and its operations, and we're worried that they're going to strike a deal with the Taliban, and that's going to undermine our efforts to keep the Taliban in check.
China has long been our global competitor economically, militarily, and technologically, and there's been a concern for years that China is stealing our intellectual property.
We're designing all these high-tech weapons, and China's hacking into the contractors' systems and stealing the information and getting some of those weapon systems online before we could even test them.
Global pandemics and climate change are both national security threats that are growing more pressing every day.
Military bases are going to have to be moved, from where they are now because they're always on the coastline. And as the coastal waters rise, you're going to get a lot of serious flooding. So for every degree that the world gets hotter, you get more people being forced out of their homes and forced into migration and refugee status. There are going to be food and water wars, and they're going to be coming a lot sooner than we think.
Climate change and COVID also lay the groundwork for other threats around the world.
Farmers are losing their crops because, the temperatures are too high and the crops are dying. They're going to become disaffected with the government, and they could become, vulnerable to outreach by extremist organizations. You could see the COVID threat was creating a lot of very angry and upset people who didn't want businesses shut down. So, you even have sectors of COVID affiliated terrorists, I think for lack of a better word, people that are willing to go to great lengths to force the government to reopen.
In August 2021, the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan, reigniting Americans' fear of terrorist attacks from overseas.
There's a very real concern that the Taliban is already talking to the remnants of Al-Qaeda and saying, we'll give you a place where you can recruit and train again. So we're basically in the same situation we were before 9/11, except now there's a concern that there's even more terrorist groups flooding into Afghanistan.
But even with the possible resurgence of international terrorism, many believe that domestic extremism should remain the priority. And some experts say that to mitigate that threat, we need to address the underlying cause.
I think the most profound threat to the U.S. right now is misinformation. When people don't know what to believe, they can believe anything, and that creates a very homegrown, real extremist threat.